Energy media readers, methane emissions from oil and gas production in Western Canada is a huge issue on the climate front, as it should be. And we've done a number of columns and news stories on leakage rates from oil and gas. You will know that 3% is the threshold between where oil, natural gas is. Below that, it's better than coal. Above that, it's worse than coal. And so leakage is a big issue. And there's a study recently out by the Environmental Defense Fund in the US on the huge Permian Basin, and it is startling in terms of the leakage rates that it's discovered. To discuss that today, we've got Colin Leydel from the EDF, so welcome to the interview, Colin.
Thank you, great to be here.
Now, give me a brief overview of the study, if you will, please, because it used satellites, and this is fairly new, I understand.
Yeah, we've got really two different studies happening in the Permian Basin. One is called permianmap.org, which is available. You can find the data on that on the website, but that's using three different measurement techniques, both aircraft, towers, and mobile monitoring on the ground. And then, as you mentioned, we also just recently came out with a satellite paper, a paper using satellite measurements from the Traphomi satellite out of the Netherlands. And so what we've seen from both of those independent sources is that methane emissions in the Permian Basin are extremely high. The Permian map came up with a 3.5% leakage rate in our study area, and the Traphomi satellite came up with a 3.7 leakage rate for the entire basin. So we are seeing very high methane loss rates in the Permian Basin.
Now, I remember the study that the EDF did in the Barnett Shale 5 years ago, and where you found that 50% of the leaks came from super emitters, which are facilities where you might have a broken valve or a hatch that's left open, something like that. Is that the same for this study?
Yes, the Permian map study so far are finding very large emission sources which represent a large percentage of the overall emissions. So that is very consistent with the super emitter theory. I think that what we're seeing is potentially flaring playing an outsized role in regards to emissions in the basin. Certainly you'd rather the gas be burned than vented, but I think what we're finding is that flares malfunction in the field much more often than perhaps the current data would indicate. So there are large emission events happening in the basin. Many of them could be tied to malfunctioning flares, but certainly other sources as well.
Now, there's been a problem for a couple of years now with lack of takeaway capacity, lack of pipelines to ship gas, and so producers have been flaring and venting more than they normally would. What role has that played in the data that you're seeing, do you think?
Well, I think that there's no doubt that there is an infrastructure capacity issue in the Permian Basin. It's not as bad as it is in other basins, like take the Bakken, for example. But what happens when you have a lack of infrastructure is you have gas backing up in the system, leading to overpressurization events, more increased flaring, of course, since you can't get the gas to market. So yeah, there's no doubt that infrastructure plays a role. I think that there's also just a situation where the economic incentives aren't there for operators to do other things that may be more operational in nature, such as investing in centralized gathering systems, extra equipment to treat the gas. So yes, there's a problem getting the gas from the pipeline to other uses, but there is also a problem of operators actually spending the money to get the gas to the pipeline. So there's a variety of different issues, and it all comes down to a lack of economic incentive. And if you don't have a regulatory body that's willing to put their foot down and say, we're not going to tolerate this, the investments just won't get made.
Now, that's a very good point. The Texas Railroad Commission has a history and a reputation of being, well, we'll call it friendly to industry. And I gather that the Railroad Commission, which is equivalent to the Alberta Energy Regulator in Alberta and the BC Oil and Gas Commission in British Columbia. So is the Railroad Commission suggesting that it's willing to regulate on this, or is it going to take the federal government? And then, of course, that brings up the issue of the Trump White House.
Yeah, I would say that, trying to take as fair of a view as possible, there has been an increased conversation in Texas over the last year or two that has included industry about trying to address the flaring issue in the Permian Basin. And I think there is some hope there. We're currently involved in what's called a proration debate at the Railroad Commission, and that has more to do with the historical role that the Railroad Commission has played in curtailing oil development to meet market demand. But there is some discussion about trying to work flaring into that, since the authority to prorate comes from the agency's authority to prevent waste. And so there's no greater and more obvious example of physical waste out in the oil field than flaring. So I guess to sum that up, I would say there's been increased conversations around preventing flaring. We haven't gotten there yet, but EDF is hopeful that we're going to get there.
Now, one of the arguments that industry makes is leave us alone, we'll fix this, because in fact methane makes up 85–90% of natural gas, and what gets leaked is, if we could stop the leaks, we could actually sell that product, so there's an economic incentive there. And while that makes some sense in theory, I suppose, it never seems to lead to anything in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that claim by industry doesn't hold any water, particularly in the oil basins like the Permian Basin, where the economics of the well are built around the liquids. The dry gas is at best a marginal profit center, at worst treated as a waste product. And when you're flaring, as in the case of the Permian Basin, 5% of the product, I'm not quite sure you can say the economic incentives are there to capture the gas. And so I really think that claim just doesn't hold water, and the data isn't supporting it.
Colin, thank you very much for this. It's very interesting, and we're going to be following what's going on in the Permian Basin with some interest, because I think what's going on there has lessons and applications in Western Canada, particularly Alberta. Any final thoughts?
Well, I think that it's going to be interesting to see coming over the coming months as production declines. We expect production to decline to see what happens with emissions. I think that there's certainly scenarios in which we could see some emission decreases. There's also ways to game it out where we may see increases. So, the future could be interesting, and we'll be out there collecting data and reporting on it in real time.
Colin, thank you very much, and good luck with the project.
Thank you, Markham.